Welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining our final session this year at GSE. In this session, we are very lucky to be joined by none other than Cheryl Watson and Frank Kine from Watson and Walker. I'm sure many of you in the call will be familiar with the renowned Cheryl Watson's tuning letter. In this presentation, they will be taking us through the new Parmlib options in ZOS 2.3 and 2.4 with recommendations on whether you should change the defaults or leave them. As per usual, feel free to leave any questions you have in the chat box as we go along. And Cheryl and Frank will answer them towards the end of the presentation. And I'll also paste in a link as well where you can leave some session feedback. That will really help us plan the next year's conference as well, if you could leave some at the end. And with that said, over to you, Cheryl and Frank.
Thank you so much. We are really delighted to be here. I would say some of my most favorite conferences were those held at GSE. And I think it's because you have better pubs than we do, but it was always fun. So thanks for letting us join this time. Okay, Frank is going to move the slides, and if I go too slow, he's going to speed them up. So as you may have heard of us, we're most well known for our tuning letter and CPU charts. And Frank is writing almost all of the tuning letter these days. Besides that, we do consulting and teaching. You will find there, you could see the difference between my COVID hair and my pre-COVID hair in the photo with our techies. We're a very small company, about 10 people total. That's Brenda White on the left, Alan Murphy, Frank Kine, Tom Walker, my husband. The short one's me, and Mario Betsy on the right. Everybody but me and Tom have worked for IBM, are ex-IBMers. So they really know what they're talking about. The main thing we do is figure out how to reduce cost. Okay. The reason that ParmLive is so important is that IBM spends millions and millions of dollars on these great new ZOS enhancements, but they are required to ship them as deactivated. And the way you normally activate them is through ParmLive. So if you use the defaults, you don't get to use any of the new functions that IBM developers have worked so hard to provide. So that's why it's important. There are two typical ways of coding the members. One is you only put in those statements you override. And the other is you specify every single statement and then you put in the IBM defaults as they were on the day that you entered them. But IBM changes the defaults. That's good and bad, because if they change it, it means that they did it for a good reason and their new default is better than the old. And you might not notice that if you specify every single statement. So our recommendation is only code your overrides. Have as small a ParmLib as absolutely possible. Okay. If you look at all these changes, you'll find that most of the changes regard security, large pages, reduction of assembler knowledge, and supports for containers or TFP pricing. we really don't want to get into containers or TFP pricing here, but that's the majority of changes that were made. Whenever you see a highlight in yellow, that's our recommendation. Might be IBM's too, but it's certainly our recommendation. We are going to have references to our tuning letter articles. Those are only available for our paid subscribers. However, if you see something you're interested in and aren't a subscriber, we'll send you the corresponding article or section of the article to describe things in more detail. Just let us know. Okay. I love, well, you're going to read the red before you're going to read the top. So let me start at the bottom. The tech docs at Washington Systems Center and ATS used to be one of our favorite locations for documentation. And one of the reasons is that things didn't have to necessarily go through all the lawyers to get stored there. So you could find presentations and white papers and the most useful information. And like other things that IBM is doing, they have a website guru that is intent on destroying IBM websites. And they've destroyed tech docs. You could see our blog post. Already one of the links doesn't work, but it's not the ZOS people that are doing this. It's somebody higher up, and they won't listen to me. I've tried to make them aware of it. With the blog post, I've been emailing the people that I think can do something about it, but very little is being done. So please make your concerns known to IBM if you think the tech docs are good things to be able to get to. The two manuals that you mainly use for ParmLib are the init and tuning reference and the init and tuning guide. They have a new way of naming most manuals now, starting with 2.3. They added a -30 as the suffix of the manual number. And whenever you go to that link for -30, and the handout's up there, anything underlined in blue is a hot link. If you go to hit the -30 link, you will get the init and tuning reference from 2.3. Now they finalized that back in June of 2019, and it's why I have that date there. So you can click on the -30 forever, it remains the same. You can click on the -40 for 2.4, and what you will get is the newest release. So if I'm talking about this is the status with the init and tuning reference, I have to give you a date to tell you which one it relates to, because they might have changed the defaults or they might have changed something after the July 26th refresh. Like I've just looked at the 10/26 refresh. It doesn't have anything new that applies to this. But this tells me how far back I need to go. And it tells you what we're looking at. The other thing that is useful for the -30-40 is that if I have a manual number for something in 2.2, I can usually, not always, usually add -30 and -40 to that and find the newest manual. Okay, I just love the new manuals. For those who take our tuning letter, you'll see that ParmLib has always been part of our love. And so these are simply articles for you. All right. Now, let's get into the ParmLiveMembers himself. In general, what we'll do for each ParmLiveMember is we'll indicate what it's used for. We'll indicate how you can look at your own settings. And then what was new in 2.3 and 2.4. So OPT used to be used for SRM constants. It now controls zip, hyperspatch, IRD, boast. It has a lot of new things in it. In 2.3, there wasn't a lot where you need to change anything. So we'll go on to the next slide. And in 2.4, they have a new parameter. This parameter says there is a message, IRA 405I, that's issued whenever the percent of storage goes below whatever value you have there. And the default is 50. IBM added and that's been around. And IBM added a recommendation. So most people may not have seen this. You'd have to be a weirdo like me who likes to look at all the change bars in SMF manuals and ParmLive manuals. But what it said is DB2, ZCX, and other applications fix the majority of the frames. And it's very easy to get above 50% fixed storage. So if you keep getting that message, and obviously the only reason IBM adds this is because they've seen customers get this message over and over and over and over again. So you may want to change that parameter. They also added a new parameter in 2.4 to indicate the number of minutes before the end of an IPL boost period when WLM sysplex routing reduces the weight. We don't have any experience with this. It's also available on 2.3. So if you have a Z15 and you like this boost, which everybody we've talked to loves, then you may have this parameter to play with. Let us know. I can't tell you how many hours I spent trying to figure out these statements called alternate weight management times or throughput. And there are two parameters, CCC, AWMT, that's kind of global, and zip and zappy WMT that are for zips and zaps. And so I thought they were similar, but they aren't. So after I figured them all out, my conclusion is don't set them. Leave them at their defaults. For IIP honor priority to yes, hyper dispatch yes, CCAWMT and ZipAWMT, whatever those parameters are, don't set them. Now, on the other hand, if you use those defaults, then you can use WLM's honor priority and set it by service class and say, I don't want this non-important zip eligible work to ever go on my CPs, especially during rolling 4-hour average or if I'm using TFP. And if so, then you can force those service classes to zips. So I think that's the main setting there. In OPT, also there's CP enablement for IO. It's with a CP enable parameter. And in the highlight there, you can see the format. CP enable equal 5,15, and it used to be 10,30. And what the new recommendation is if the number of IOs handled through test pending interrupt is more than 15%, that is, we're delaying over 15% of the IOs because we don't have a CP available to handle them, then I want to enable another CP to handle IOs for a while until the percent handled is less than 5%, and then I'll start disabling those CPs. Now, what happened was, and why this change came about, is that before Z14, CPs were enabled for the highest vertical high to the lowest vertical high CP. And once they were enabled, then they were enabled for highest mediums, vertical mediums. On Z14, they're enabled from the lowest to the highest. And what was happening is because of changes in dispatching for the 14s and 15s for IO interrupts, IBM came out with a Washington System Center flash. I did check, this flash will get you to a new paper that used to be flash 10337. And where IBM said, let's take it down from 10,30 because not enough CPs are getting enabled. And we'll show that on the next slide. But I also want to mention, I'm sorry. I had hoped Kathy would present, or somebody from WSC would present, this Hot Topics in ZOS Performance. It was in IBM Systems Tech U Talks. If you can get to that from your company, you need to be a member or have access. But she's allowing me to use 2 of her slides. So these 2 slides are from her presentation. And on the first slide, you'll see off to the right-hand side, the second column from the left, from the second column from the right is the number of IO interrupts handled by a processor. So this said 2182 IOs per second were handled from CP7. However, we can see that it had enabled other CPs to handle those IO interrupts. So we could see that CPU 0 handled 224 per second. So that's what it used to look like. Now on the next slide, you'll see in, this is in Z14 or Z15, you'll see everything is handled on CPU 0. And so and what happens is that enablement only happens every 20 seconds. So you need to be a little more aggressive in enabling those, or else what you're going to get is delayed response times for IOs. All right. IFEOPZ XX was originally created for ABO. What the member does is it allows you on a system-wide basis to concatenate a new library with an older library, and you don't have to change any JCL. And it can be concatenate PDSs or PDSEs. So if you're migrating to a new compiler, like COBOL version 6, it also works really, really well. So if you have a COBOL 6 PDSE concatenated ahead of a COBOL 4 PDS, you'll pick up the new one each time. It's really wonderful technique. Okay. IGGCAT specifies parameters used by the catalog address space. There's a parameter called cat max that has a max of default of 1024. I have to tell you, I have seen almost nobody change that parameter. But IBM came in in 2.3 and added an important note. Now remember, only weirdos like me read these little change bars. So most people didn't get the word. And what they're saying is they don't want you to waste memory. So this value should not exceed the number of open data sets for an address space as determined by the size of the TIOT specified in the alloc Parmlib parameter. So if you specify a 32K TIOT, then in the alloc member, it says, don't set this any higher than 1635. So do this to match IBM's recommendation. And what you'll save is some memory. IKJTSO is a parameter that applies to all TSO users. In 2.3, they had allowed an 8-character user ID. We heard people asking for that before it became available, but we've never seen any customer use it. So in 2.4, what they did was they added several comments in that. In 2.4, they also added a new parameter called timeout. And that's if you start to log on to TSO and you get a TSO logon proceeding, and it just sits there and you walk away and it sits there and sits there. This isn't good for security. So starting with a share requirement and an RFE, IBM added with an APAR this new parameter called timeout with a default of 5. It says 5 minutes. If you have logon proceeding for 5 minutes, then terminate this session. Now, you could still go over to another machine and say, logon reconnect. That doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't leave that terminal hung. Okay. IZUPRM, this is was added in 2.3 to give you general configuration options for setting up ZOSMF, because the other options were putting in Unix parameters that people didn't like to deal with. And so what they did was they created a ParmLiveMember where you could put some of those parameters. So if you're on 2.3, we had said that you ought to create this ParmLiveMember because it's easier. All the developers liked it. But on second hand, they came out with some new APARs that you should be aware of. And they're only on APARs. So the first APAR, which came out in June, allows you to dynamically change IZUParm. That was a big thing because otherwise you had to take down ZOSMF or you had to re-IPL. Was not a good thing. So if you're using IZUParm, apply that PTF, apply those PTFs. The other thing they brought out in the same month was a new way to manage your parms that is better than IZUParm. And that is a new panel in ZOSMF called General Options. Now, obviously, if you have parameters in the GUI interface, the ZOSMF GUI interface, and your IZUParm, then you need to make sure that you're changing the right one. But our recommendation is use general options whenever possible. Now, another thing that occurred was that people wouldn't go to ZOSMF because they couldn't get it tested on their small dev test or sandbox LPARs because they didn't have much memory, or they put it on a small machine, or they had a ZPDT, or they were running on a small CPC to begin with. And it would take forever. Frank said that he would go have lunch while ZOSMF was coming up on a ZPTD. But a team at IBM and our dear Frank Kine did a lot of work to improve the time. And here is a hot link to ZOSMF that says, apply all these PTFs to make the server start significantly faster. And we think that's a really good thing. Okay. SMF lim. This is a good parameter to start using. It's been around a while. It lets you define parameters that would normally go in IFEOPZ exit with assembler. And what they do every release is add more and more filters and parameters that you can specify. So in 2.4, they had new filter statements. And I'm not going to go into these, but I just want you to realize that anything you put on these can be taken out of the assembler exit. So there's less assembler to deal with. Next slide. And then in 2.4, they added a new one on, there was a parameter called region above that says, what is the maximum size of the region above the line? We could say no limit or specify a number of gig or meg or K. But the IFEOPZ exit overrode that parameter. So if you say in the parameter override IFEOPZ, you can't get away with this, then this member will take precedence. So obviously this is a new parameter, but we recommend you put in this override or you may not know what's happening. That's all on this slide. SMF Parm. Of course, Frank has got to let me talk about SMF Parm because SMF is my thing, has been for years. This gives parameters for what you store on SMF. And in 2.3, they brought in a new option, a new statement called inmem. And it gives the name of a resource for streaming. And it gives the type of records that would be stored in memory for real-time processing. It wasn't used a lot in 2.3, but vendor after vendor after vendor is starting to use it. So you need to be on top of this. Get familiar with inmem if you haven't started using it, just to see how you can change it, how many resources you might take. Check with your vendors on this, because I think you'll see some of those coming. Also in 2.3, they increased the max number of record types to 2047. So if you have something in your ParmLive that says, take everything from 128 to 255 and move it to this one SMF data set or stream, now the range can be 2047. Next one. High frequency throughput statistics was brought out in 2.3. And what it does is every hour, 4 times an hour, for a minute, it collects data in 5-second increments. And we've found it very useful for debugging short duration problems. But the default of 30 was too high. And so IBM and we recommend 5 seconds there instead of every 30, instead of 30-second increments. And you'll find those in the 98.1 records. In 2.4, there was a security feature added for alternate signature methods to protect SMF records. I know nothing about that. You can show this to your security people and maybe they might. WIC, I believe there was a session on WIC this week, workload interaction correlator feature. If that's specified in SMF Parm, the HFTS interval right above is ignored, but the records, the 98.1 records, are still written out every 5 seconds, along with the ZWIC. Now you'll have 98.2 records. Is that it, Frank? Forgot about SMF count. SMF count indicates whether CPU MF counters are recorded in the type 30 records. You have to be running this collecting these counters. But if you do, they're stored in the type 30 records if you say SMF 30 count. And why it's important is that the store into instruction stream code, it can severely impact performance. And you can use the SMF 30 count to identify those situations. So absolutely override this and look at this white paper for more details. And now I'm going to turn it over to Frank, but I just want to tell you that I'm going to miss you all. I am 76 and in the COVID die range. And so I'm not setting foot on a plane for a very long time. And, but you'll see plenty of Frank. Okay, thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Cheryl. So I'm Frank Kine. I just want to thank Cheryl. I should point out that just about all of these slides are created by Cheryl. I've never seen anybody that loves doing research as much as she does. So Cheryl did, the slides, all the research behind them. And then she said to me, well, which half would you like to do? So I said, oh, I'm not that stupid. So obviously I like the easy half. So Cheryl took all the hard ones and I get the easy ones. Okay, it's looking at the time, we're good. So again, same format as Cheryl had previously. So we start off with a display command so you can figure out what the current settings are. And then if we have a recommendation, it's very easy to go in and check, your current setting against a recommendation and decide if, they're different. Maybe you'd like to investigate and, think about if you'd like to make the change. So the first one in this IGGCAT member is this opcdb split. And that basically, it's to do with system managed tape libraries. If you have multiple tape libraries and you code opcd equals b in the JCL, it's pretty obscure. But if you do all those things, that basically says, okay, so I have a single data set, multi-volume single data set. I'd like you to treat that as multiple concatenated data sets, so have them sort of in parallel, if you like, instead of serially. And if you do that, the way it used to work was just explicit. So that explicit says, if I want to do that, I have to list on my DD card, Voltaire equals 1, 2, 3, and so forth. If you specify the catalog option, that also will let you use the explicit, definition of the volumes, if you like. But it says, well, if they're not defined in the JCL, then I'll go to the catalog and I can pick up what the list of volumes are from the catalog. So, but basically, to me, I'm far from an expert in any of this stuff, but it would seem that, the catalog option sort of gives you the best of both worlds, and that, I can work the old way if I want to. If I don't want to code all the voltaires, then I'll get that information from the catalog. So this seems like one of those cases where you might want to move off the default value. One thing just to point out, a set alloc command lets you change, I think, nearly all of the parameters in the alloc member dynamically. But in the manual, system commands manual, it doesn't actually list this opcdb split command, but you get a parameter, but you can actually change that dynamically. So might be something you'd want to test out on the test system first, but it should work. Just 3 other things. These are not new, okay? But sadly, we do a fair number of system reviews for our clients, and these are 3 that are, typically still set at the default values, and the defaults really don't make sense anymore. So I just want to point out, the first one says if I do an IFBR14 to delete a migrated data set, the default way is that he recalls the data set and then he deletes it. You can use this parameter to say, well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Just delete it out of HSM and don't bother with the recall. Batch recall migrated data sets says, again, the default way is he goes out and he says, I want to access these 10 data sets. Oh, the first one's migrated. Okay, so Mr. HSM, can I please have that first one back? And I'm going to sit here and put my feet up while I wait for that to happen. And the data set comes back and he has a look and he says, oh, the next one's migrated as well. Mr. HSM, can I have that one back too? So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, particularly in these days with virtual tape and everything. So you can override that and say, do them all in parallel. Makes far more sense. Okay, and it happens at the job step level. So, if you have a whole ton of migrated data sets in the one job with multiple steps, he's only going to recall them as you get to each step, because obviously there's no point, recalling data sets and then the job ends before you get to that step. Okay, so it actually behaves in a very sensible manner if you override the default value. And the last one, memory data set NQ management, and that's really for customers that have large DB2s. There's one example I saw, I think it was on a Z13, and it was taking 45 minutes to start DB2. I had 100,000 data sets I was trying to use, but the bulk of that time was because of the way they're handling the NQs. So if you have a big DB2, you should look at changing the default value for this MEM DS NQ management. Yeah, as I said, that they're not new, but sadly, exactly as Cheryl said, the rule in IBM traditionally was, you have to ship changes turned off, and then the customer has to take an explicit action to turn them on. So it's a good example. Oh, I forgot to open up my camera. I apologize for turning my camera on. You can put a piece of sticky tape over your screen or something so you don't have to look at me. Okay, next one. Large frames. So there's a display space VS, LF area command, and it's been there for many releases now, and it will show you basically that the sort of the bottom 2/3 of that information on the right. So it gives you information about 1 meg pages, fixed 1 meg pages, and fixed 2 GB pages or frames. It doesn't give you any information about page for 1 megabyte pages. So for some reason, rather than changing the command, they shipped this Rex exec called IAXDMem. So you can issue this in the console. You say modify AXR, IAXDMem, and it gives you that display on the right side of the screen. So you can see now you get information about your page for pages at the top, as well as your fixed 1 meg and 2 gig. Okay, so we recommend, this. If you're going to be looking at large pages, definitely you want to know about the page as well as the fixed. So you can still use the DVS LF area if you want, but this one pretty much summarizes all the information and gives you the pageable as well. Now, in this example, okay, and this is so frustrating to see this. So I think one of the first articles I did after I joined Cheryl was about using large pages, 1 meg pages or 2 gig pages, and why it was beneficial. And in very round numbers, and it depends on your workload and yada yada, it saves about 3% of your CPU, and because of the way it uses the look-aside buffer more effectively. Anyway, lots of people don't do that, okay? And I would say, as we look at customer sites, there are more people, sadly, that don't use the LF area than there are that do, which is a shame, because it's free. You don't pay any extra for it. Well, you do, I guess. If you don't use it, you pay for using more MIPS. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And for people that we see that have specified a value, often every page is used. So they turned it on, and DB2 or MQ, whoever started using it, and then it got all used up, and then they never went back and increased the value as its usage changed over time. And while I'm on this slide, I'll just briefly talk about this in ZOS 2.3. They changed it. It used to be if you said I want 1,000 1 megabyte fixed pages, your IPL, you get 1,000 fixed pages, whether you ever use them or not. In 2.3, they said, okay, now the 1,000 is a maximum value. And so if you only ever use 200, you'd only get 200 pages put aside. You're not going to get the whole gig put aside. So I think that is a big improvement, because that hopefully means that people can be a little bit more, I don't know, adventurous about setting higher values, knowing that they're not going to have a bunch of memory locked up and nobody ever using it. And Peter had an excellent share session last year, and that's a hot link to her share session. So I'd really encourage people to look at this area. Next one, language environment. Again, there's a display CE, all command. The change is really just a documentation change. So there's an option to say non-overridable. So you can specify an option in there, and then you can say, I don't want, at the individual program level for people to be able to override this. So you can say non-OVR. Apparently doing that has broken some vendor programs. So IBM now recommend that you don't do that. Okay, that's fine. What isn't so clear is that if you decide, okay, I'm going to take off that non-OVR option, to make that effective, you need to issue a set CE clear command, and then you have to do another command to actually implement your changes. Okay, so sort of a two-step change. And the last one down the bottom there, non-executable storage. This is instruction execution protection. The idea being that you can mark a lump of storage and say, or memory, this is only for data. Okay? You can't execute any instructions in there, because apparently a regular hacker tool is to come along, they'll write something that appears to be data, stick it out somewhere in memory, and then they do a branch to that what should be data, and they start executing actual instructions there. So this is a security thing. It's turned on by default. There's a recent Kix-related LE APR. You should have a look at if you're going to be using this. I have the APR there. It only came out 2 months ago in September. The DevSubMember. Interesting a little bit that there's two display commands, so it has a whole lot of parameters in here, but there are 2 commands that you need to issue if you want to see the full set of current settings. So you do the ddevsub, that will show you a subset that's new in ZOS 2.4, and then you do a modified devman report, and that will show you the remaining parameters. So there isn't one command that shows you everything. Don't ask me, I have no idea why they did it that way. Anyway, in 2.3, there's a setting ICK DSF _verify offline, and that basically says if you don't specify, either verify offline or no verify offline in an init or a reformat job, what you want the default to be. Okay, so you basically you can set the default in here and say if they don't specify either, do you want me to verify if it's offline, yes or no? Okay, so you can control that in the DevSubMember. Next one, it's good. I think, again, Cheryl referenced this idea about new functions being shipped turned off, is that there's some new HBF related functions here. The good thing is that they're shipped enabled by default, which is great. If for some reason you're not using HBF, I'd strongly recommend that you have a look at that tech doc that's linked there. And I checked, and that as of this morning at least, that link was still working. I mean, the difference in performance between traditional FICON and HBF is really night and day. So if you're not using HBF, at a minimum, you should at least go and have a look at that tech doc, and you can see what the scale of the difference is. The other one, there's a recent APAR 58111 that enables the use of HBF for VTOCs. And again, you can have people nowadays with these huge big VTOCs because they've got huge big volumes. So we recommend that be enabled. Okay. Next one, first one, if you have a problem when the system tries to refresh the UCB, at the moment, if that happens, well, prior to this new function, it would put a message out. The message that they list in the APAR is IEA253I. I don't actually think that's the correct message number, because that basically just lists the contents of the DevSubMember. I don't think that's actually the correct message to tell you that he had a problem refreshing the UCB. But I looked and I couldn't find what that message was. So if I come across that somehow, I'll update this presentation. But anyway, so previously you would just say, oh, I've had a problem, and carry on about his merry way. With this, you can say, well, if there's a problem refreshing the UCB, that I don't really want to continue using that volume. So you can say, vary off _RO dev, and that says, if you have a problem, please vary the device offline. Okay, if it won't go offline, then change it to be read only. So at least I can't go and try and update a volume that appears to have some sort of damage on it. Next one is only for people that are using arrays on scratch with non-IBM DASD, and it controls the number of logical record arrays, CCWs, that can be changed to get chained together. When they brought out this arrays on scratch first, many years ago when I was young, the performance was horrific. Now it's, in most cases, you wouldn't even know if it's turned on or not. So if you have sensitive data anywhere, you really should be enabling arrays on scratch, okay? If you have non-IBM DASD, you should talk to your vendor about this setting and see what value they recommend. Right? And the last one is to do with problems with a VTOC index. And again, it's to do with recovery if you have a problem. Previously, they would just turn off the VTOC index, which isn't so good if you have a huge volume and a big VTOC. So basically, if you specify this retry stat11 and stat11 preserve index equals yes, they'll try to maintain the index, the VTOC index, and recover from the problem. The DIAG member, I presume everybody is familiar with or aware at this point that user key common storage has gone away in 2.4. Well, sort of gone away. That was for security reasons. They brought out an option called RUXA back in 2.3, and I think it was rolled back to 2.1, that basically would let, in a more controlled manner, people could use user key common. But this genuinely is a security issue that IBM want to get rid of. But they also have customers that said, yeah, I know it's a security issue. I do want to fix it, but I need to get to 2.4 before I have a chance to do that. So, you know, RUXA is a way to help those people, but in 2.4, it's chargeable. And not that I'm a huge fan of giving IBM additional money, but I do think that's good, because now you can go along to your manager and say, you know, that this thing's an security exposure and it's costing us money. Yeah, and today, you know, the only thing that matters anywhere in the world, it seems, is money. So you say that magic word, you know, we can save money if we can fix this problem. You know, maybe that will get some movement on addressing that. So that's RUXA. Next one, pre-mainframes. This was brought out on Z13, and it's because Z13 had many more processors, and if you have a really big LPAR, when it breaks the association between a page and a physical frame, you do an IPTE, and IPTE issues a signal to every CP in that LPAR, and that was really high overhead. Okay, so they said, okay, we're going to change the way it works. And so now, if you do a free main, we're going to say, oh yeah, that's fine. But under the cover, he's not actually going to break that association yet. Okay, this is trying to reduce the overhead. Unfortunately, during the DSP, some customers had some problems, and they said, okay, you know, you have to make this thing, you know, by default work the way it used to work. And then, was it that one? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm mixing it up with another one. A different option. Now this one, it should be set to yes, but if you have jobs that are causing you a problem, you can exclude those specific jobs on that exclude job list. So just make sure that's set to yes. Okay. Next one, this is just saying you have the option now to move these 3 new control blocks above the 16 meg line, which is sort of tourist information. What's important is that they also said in the future release, you know, they might make that, you know, that it has to reside in 31-bit storage. So if that's the case, it's probably better for you to look at this now when you have time, try to figure out does anything use these control blocks and can it be moved, and try to fix the situation now instead of when you're, you know, up against a deadline. Next one, ASLR, is this address space layout randomization. Again, this is to do with hacking. So they sort of, you know, break up, you know, the location of storage within an address space. That's turned off by default. We recommend that you look at that and try to get over time, move to a point where you can turn that on. And it's really just purely about security. The next one down, this is a new option they added for auto IPL. Normally auto IPL will do a clear IPL, which does take longer. They give you the option now using this nuke label to say that you want to do an IPL normal instead of an IPL clear. Okay. The downside of that is that it can have an impact on the availability of reconfigurable storage. So even in the IBM documentation, they say, you know, you really shouldn't use this unless you are so tight on IPL time that the difference between a normal IPL and a clear IPL has a business impact on you. Okay. Now, hopefully, if you have a Z15, boost system recovery boost will offset this. So, but we just want to make you aware that it's there. Next one, all I want to point out here, 2 things. One, the C block, again, same parameter. The real 31 and real 64, those keywords are really there for future use. If you specify them, you'll actually get an error message, okay? So basically just ignore them for the time being, that they're presumably the next release of ZOS, IBM will use them at that point. The other thing is, if you look in the manual, the layout is a little bit sort of messed up. Oh, thank you, 10 minutes. In that it looks like the virtual and the real parameters are separate parms, just like C block, instead of being sub-parameters of the C block keyword. So I think they're aware of that and they're going to fix that. Just be careful if you are setting that. You probably want to try the format on a test system first before you let it loose on production. Next one, traps, again, is about identifying people that are using user key common. The article that we did on that, I think there's numerous ways to find out who's doing that. It's in the SMF 30 records, it's a health check, it's all over the place. And this is just another option. So if you're struggling with user key common, trying to get to 2.4, if you let us know, we'll send you a copy of that article. It's a short user reference, about 20 pages long. 2.4, just to point out, allow user key CSA is forced to no, because you can't have user key CSA on 2.4, and they removed an all nuke label. Okay, last one on this, this use ZOS V1R9 rules. This is tied back to that mem DSNQ management from earlier. Again, we recommend that should be set to no. Okay, you use V1R9 rules basically says I want you to work the old way, which is not the most efficient way if you got a large DB2. Okay, so change that to no. This is old information. The IEA member, you can display all the settings of the DIPL info or DIPL info comma, whatever the keyword is, like, I don't know, logrec, and it'll show you what the setting of that parameter is. LF area, I mentioned already, that was changed in 2.3. They've updated the documentation, so make sure you have a look at that to understand how things work now. Ruxa, again, we covered that. OS Protect, this is, if you remember, this meltdown thing was all ago, a couple of years back, back in 2018. So IBM brought out a remediation, it was called. And there's sort of two levels, system and a higher level of protection is one. One is the recommended value. The fear was that it has a high overhead. On some other platforms, this actually can cause an overhead of up to 30%. The feedback we've seen from IBM and from our customers is that they set it to 1 and nobody noticed. Yeah, so I guess if you're in an IBM lab, maybe you can see, measure a small difference. In the real world, I don't think you can. And again, this crazy world we live in, with all these security issues, anything that you can do to make things a little bit safer is probably a good idea. ICSF, as Cheryl said, I can't spell it, pronounce it. I know absolutely nothing about it, except that anytime I try to read up on crypto, I get maybe 2 paragraphs into it, and I come to the conclusion that the most secure thing about crypto is that nobody can understand it. So that this basically in IEA lets you specify a default name for the ICSF address space and what parameter you want to use for it. I won't go any further than that. Boost, I think, is a nice feature. Even nicer is the fact it's turned on by default. Okay, so really nothing you need to worry about that. RACF is that you can have up to 3 IRR Parm members. So well, actually, I'll come back to that in a couple of slides. But we recommend that you use this instead of the old range table and the dataset name table. Next one, SMF TBUF. That says there's a temporary buffer he sets up at IPL time to hold SMF records that get created before the system's fully up and running. The default is 5 meg. You might need a larger value. If you look in your SMF type 0, 7, or 23 records, it will report if there was data lost during the IPL. And is it really that important? Probably not. Do you want to have to explain to an auditor why there's a lump of SMF data missing and what that data might be? I think it's easier just to check in, see if you're losing any, and then bump up this value. SMS, wow, nearly out of time. SMS, the only one I want to point out there is the CA reclaim. The default has changed in 2.3 from none to data class. So that's fine. Just make sure that you haven't got hard-coded none in your IGGCAT member. Hyperlinks for VSAM are turned on by default. Okay, we have an article about that. This is his IRR PRM member. For rack F, it replaces the dataset name table and the range table. So recommend you use that. Logger, two new parameters. They both default to yes. They set a larger minimum size for your offload and staging data sets, but the larger size is only tiny, still only 1 meg or 10 meg. You can't unfortunately override this and give it a larger value, but the yes value is better than the default, which I think is 64K. So you should take those default values. Manage hyperwrite, that originally defaulted to yes, then they changed it to no with this APAR 57408. We spoke to them. The only reason for that change, which really makes sense, is that IBM's rules say you shouldn't turn on new functions by default. Okay, everybody that I know that has used hyperwrite think it's great. We had a tuning letter article about it, and we recommend that you change that back to yes if you're able to use hyperwrite with your disk subsystem. The next two are for GDPS customers. The next one after that is for ZAware. I don't know anybody who uses ZAware. These two, just ignore them. And this one is important. That's why I want to get to this one before we finish. When they brought out ZFS first, it had to run in its own address space, really, because of virtual storage constraints. In 2.2, they changed it so it can now use 64-bit buffers. So you have the option of you can run it in OMBS address space or in its own address space called a colony address space. When we were doing the work that Michelle mentioned on ZOS Smuff Startup, Gary Pushkov recommended to us that we try changing this to run in OMBS instead of its own address space. When we did that, it literally took minutes of CPU time off the startup of ZOS MF. So if you have applications running on ZOS that are very Unix file system IO intensive, I certainly would recommend that you try changing that. It doesn't impose any limitations that I'm aware of, and it works great for us, and it saves CPU time. Okay, so that was 1 minute over. That was a short presentation. There were many more parameters that we didn't cover. Cheryl and I felt these are the most interesting ones. Some of them are brand new, some are a little bit older, but as I said, we frequently find that people are still using old values or bad old default values. So we really want to try to make you aware of that. Other than that, I hope we encourage you to keep an eye on the init and tuning reference. All roads in ZOS ZOS run to the init and tuning reference. So definitely keep an eye on that and the updates. We try to keep all our customers up to date in the tuning ladder. If you have any questions, please send us an email. We love hearing from people, unless it's a bill. Don't send us any bills. Our email address is there, technical@watsonwalker.com. Please fill out the session feedback. Please, there's a nominated charity. Okay, please give some money to that. I think that this conference, was really one of the best conferences I've taken part in all year, and it was free. It's incredible. If you look at what we normally would have spent to go and attend, have a number of people go and attend the conference, asking people to give a little bit of money to charities instead, I think is a fantastic idea. And people really need the help at the moment. So I just remind you, please give a few bob to that. And I think that's it. Piara, do you have any?
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Really appreciate your very precious time. Thoroughly enjoy the presentation as well. Just want to thank all the attendees for joining all of our performance and capacity sessions this year, over the past 2 weeks. As Frank has mentioned, I've left the links to the Virgin Money Giving page in the chat box, and also the link to leave session feedback as well in the chat box as well. And with that said, I believe we are now just waiting for, oh no, sorry, I think Mark Wilson's keynote has started. So if anyone wants to attend that, feel free to join that session now as well. And with that said, thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Cheryl and Frank. I hope you all have an enjoyable rest of the day.
Thanks very much, Pierre. Thank you for your help.
No worries, anytime. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.